Rebecca Klein has worked for the Huffington Post for 5.5 years. Her primary job there is reporting on education issues focusing on K through 12. She's reported on a number of exclusive stories, some of them involving Florida. I recently reached out to Rebecca to talk to her about her career reporting at the Huffington Post, as well as some of the work she's done. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. So, how long have you been working for the Huffington Post? Where did you used to work?
I've been at HuffPost for 5.5 years. Before that, I was working at WNYC, which is our NPR affiliate in New York. And before that, I was in college.
So what got you into reporting on education? Has that always been your focus on reporting?
Yeah, that's primarily been my focus. I took a bunch of education policy classes when I was an undergrad, and I quickly figured out that I did not want to be an educator or an education practitioner, but the issues surrounding education really fascinated me. So I also wanted to be a journalist, so this seemed like the perfect combination of these interests.
So why didn't you want to be an educator?
Quite frankly, I just don't think I'd be very good at it. Not great with kids. I don't think I personally would find it to be fulfilling, only because I don't think that I would be a great teacher. Don't have the patience.
Whenever I hear Betsy DeVos, our Secretary of Education, talk about education, she always brings up school choice and that parents should be able to choose where their kids go to school. In December of last year, you wrote how Betsy DeVos's voucher program that she's pushing on a federal level, that is part of her school choice push, is going to non-accredited private schools that are run by evangelical Christian churches, and tax dollars are going to these schools. What exactly is a voucher program, and what is the issue at large with these schools and their curriculum that's being taught?
Sure. A voucher program is a private school choice program where students are essentially, in the most basic form, given publicly funded scholarships to attend a private school. So each voucher program, they're now in a number of states, each voucher program looks different and has different specifics and requirements and mechanisms for doling out that money. But generally speaking, the most basic premise of a voucher program is taking public money and giving it to kids to attend private schools. People like Betsy DeVos push this type of program because, as you mentioned, they say it's a way for kids to choose where they want to go to school. And it also helps kids go to private religious schools. A vast majority of schools that participate in these programs are religious. However, as my article from December of 2017 explains, not a single state, the most strict state is Rhode Island, but even then it's probably not as strict as it could be, but not a single state really outlines what is allowed to be taught in these schools, given that they're now receiving public funding. So they are basically allowed to teach whatever they want. They have to teach basic courses, math, science, history, etc. But within those courses, they're allowed to teach them however they want, unlike a public school where the curriculum is fairly strict and there's a certain set of requirements that you have to follow. And kids also have to take standardized tests, so they'll be measured against other students across the state. In these schools, kids don't have to take standardized tests, so you have very little insight into how they're doing, A. And B, they can be taught history or science with as extreme of a religious bent as the school would like to teach it.
Could you give me an example of an extreme religious bent that they would be using?
Sure. Yeah, so the most basic idea that you'll probably get in any fundamentalist Christian school that participates in one of these programs is that in science class you'll learn that evolution is a crazy liberal theory and that creationism is real. That's the most basic first thing you're going to get. But there's a lot of other insidious points of view that are put into these curriculum sources. So there's a lot of backwards ideas about gender and sex. I've pored over some of the popular history textbooks that are used in these schools, and they talk about how women should stay home. One of these textbooks refers to slavery as black immigration. They are extremely anti-LGBTQ. They have backwards ideas about race and racial dynamics. And they also blatantly endorse certain Republican policies and candidates.
So I want to follow up on that for a moment. So you're saying that their argument in some of these books, not all of these schools, but you're saying in some of these books that are taught, was that slavery was basically just immigration, so it was okay. Am I understanding that?
So So I wouldn't say that they say it is okay. They certainly condemn slavery as a practice, but I would say as a way of making it seem less dangerous, torturous, however you want to describe slavery, as a way of making it seem more benign, it is described as black immigration.
Okay. I wanted to make sure I was understanding that.
They definitely do not say it's okay, but it does come off more benign as you would get in a secular textbook.
So in April of this year, you wrote an article about how federal data shows how black students are being pushed out of school and how the Department of Education under Betsy DeVos is looking to get rid of these civil rights guidances that are supposed to prevent this issue. How exactly are these students being pushed out of school, and in what way is her department looking to remove these guidances?
Sure. These students are more likely to be subjected to harsh disciplinary practices. So when we say that they're being pushed out of school, this means that they are being disproportionately suspended and expelled, even for the same behaviors as white students. So a lot of researchers have looked at why this might be. It seems like there's a lot of implicit and explicit bias in terms of how educators, school administrators, and school police officers treat these students. Now, under the Obama administration, there was a piece of guidance that was put forth with best practices in terms of how schools should be disciplining students, with the idea of reducing some of these disparities. It was non-binding, but it said that if your school is found disproportionately suspending or expelling certain groups of students, you could be subject to an investigation from the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. Betsy DeVos is considering whether or not guidance was an example of federal overreach. It's still unclear what she's going to be doing, but civil rights advocates are extremely upset about the message this would send.
What is her reasoning for going over this federal overreach program? It sounds like it wasn't binding, which also sounds like a separate issue at hand, but it sounds like the rule was made to help students out. Why would this be an issue?
So Betsy DeVos has spoken to parents and school advocates who feel like this potential threat of being under investigation by the Office for Civil Rights has caused schools to change their policies at the local level in such that students who were acting out and deserve to be punished and may be a danger to the school were now being kept in the classroom in order to make sure that the school didn't have certain disproportionalities in its discipline data. So her argument, if she so chooses to revoke this piece of guidance, would be that, this is a local and state issue and that schools should be able to carry out their discipline practices as they please, so long as they are not running afoul of federal law.
Earlier this year, you exclusively reported on a middle school social studies teacher over in Citrus County, Florida, that had ties to white nationalists. How did you first find out about this?
So one of our reporters got a tip about a white nationalist podcast that had a guest who was talking about how she was a teacher. She didn't say where she was a teacher. So it was our investigation to figure out where exactly she was a teacher. And she didn't cover her tracks as much as you would think. So it actually was only a matter of hours before we could identify this teacher who was bragging about bringing her white nationalist ideology to the classroom.
So what exactly was she doing in the classroom with her white nationalist ideology? I imagine she had kids of color in this classroom, so how is she going about putting her views out there?
So she said herself on the podcast that she was doing it in subtle ways, asking kids to question certain things that they may have otherwise been taught. There was a report that the school district put out examining what her behavior was like in the classroom. They had received a complaint from a parent before about her talking to her political ideologies in the classroom. There was another employee who felt like the teacher had been specifically racist towards her. And there were interviews with students who also felt like she may have overstepped in talking about her ideas and political ideologies and also how she treated certain groups of students. She still vehemently denies the results of this report.
So this report came out before your reporting, if I'm understanding this?
No. This report, which was conducted by the school district and its attorneys, was conducted several months after our report came out to try and figure out what went wrong, how this person was allowed to stay in the classroom, and what the damage actually was.
Okay, so these complaints came out to the public, to the school at least, after you first started reporting this, if I'm getting the timeline correct?
So a parent had previously complained to the school district about this teacher and how she talked about her beliefs in the classroom, but that wasn't made public at the time. The school district did an investigation into it at the time, a very small-scale investigation, and decided that there was nothing there. Then we had our report, and the school district did a widespread investigation into this teacher and her classroom practices, and that's when all of this was made public.
You've mentioned a couple times that it wasn't just you on this story. Who else worked with you on this story?
We had two other reporters on this story, Christopher Mathias, who covers extremism in America, and Jenna Amatuli, who is on our breaking news desk.
Another exclusive story you reported on this year was how our current Florida governor, my current Florida governor I should say, Rick Scott, created a voucher program for bullied kids, but it excluded helping out kids in the LGBTQ community. How does this program work, and how is it legally able to discriminate against these kids in this community?
Yeah, so Florida has, in general, one of the biggest private school choice programs in the country. It's looked to as a leader on this issue. It has a very large tax credit program, which operates similar to a voucher program, but the mechanisms for distributing and obtaining these public dollars are a bit different. It has a voucher program for kids with disabilities and has a voucher program for low-income children, and its latest voucher program, which was just written into law several months ago, is called the Hope Scholarship Program, and this provides public scholarships for kids who were bullied to switch to a private school. So Florida, none of its private school choice programs have a comprehensive anti-discrimination policy. So as it stands, the anti-discrimination policy says you're not allowed to discriminate based on gender, race, and I believe there's a few other things, but it does not include gender identity or sexuality. So most of the religious schools that participate in these programs have policies specifically saying that LGBTQ students or kids who come from families with LGBTQ parents are not allowed to attend and will be asked to leave the school. This is true in all of the Florida voucher programs, but it's a specific hypocrisy that this program is designed for kids who are victims of bullying, and as we know, LGBTQ students are among the most bullied students.
So there's no federal protections for these students?
There's no federal or state protections for these students.
So if these students are bullied, they qualify for this program. So these students would be bullied and they'd be put into this voucher program, but then they would be kicked out of this voucher program, it sounds like. Well, none of these schools in the voucher program would accept them because they were LGBTQ. So what happens to these students then? Where do they go?
I think that's the question. So to be clear, what my analysis, which was based on 70 schools that had signed up to participate in the program as of August 1st. The schools are signing up on a rolling basis, so now it's much more. At the time, it was about 10% had zero tolerance policies for LGBTQ students. So it's not every school that's participating in it, but it is a big chunk that will not accept these students.
In this same voucher program, you also reported it also discriminates against kids with dreadlocks and progressive hairstyles. So the first question I have, what exactly is a progressive hairstyle?
I think that's a really good question. I think that there's probably some racial undertones in that term. I don't know explicitly what they meant by that.
And you also reported that it discriminates against kids with dreadlocks, which are proportionally, I think it's fair to say, people of color that would more than often have them. Now that sounds more like a racial undertone, which goes to the question of how does that not violate civil rights?
I think that's a really good question that it should be posed for an attorney. But, this is not uncommon for private schools everywhere and even in some public schools to have certain dress codes. These schools have particularly extreme ones when it comes to hair. But this is something that you could actually probably find at some of your local public schools.
Unfortunately, far too often we're seeing in the news lately is school violence, specifically around guns. Whether it's a mass shooting at a school or a teacher's gun going off in a classroom accidentally. Specifically concerning the mass shootings, we've seen this issue take the national stage, especially after Parkland, where students and teachers are trying to find solutions along with parents to preventing these. Now, President Trump and Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, along with a high percentage of Republicans have rallied around the idea of arming teachers as the solution to this issue. While on the other hand, a high percentage of Democrats and people of color and teacher unions, along with school resource officers, are against this idea. In your opinion, why do you think there's such a large difference on this particular issue?
In terms of who supports the idea of having armed teachers and administrators in schools?
Yes.
And why do I think there's such a partisan difference in this issue?
Yes, ma'am.
I would imagine that this just falls along partisan lines in terms of how people from different political parties feel about guns in general. We know that the Second Amendment and gun rights is extremely polarizing among political lines already.
In your opinion, do you have any views on this, on what you would think would try to help the situation?
In terms of making schools safer,
yes.
If there's an active shooter?
Well, just in terms of making schools safer in general, I would say.
Yeah, one thing I think it's important to note is that while there has been a few extremely devastating high-profile school shootings in the past few years, like Parkland, as you mentioned, school shootings are actually not more common than they were several decades ago, according to research. And schools are actually among the safest they've ever been if you just look at school crime overall. So because of how devastating and high profile these incidents of violence have been, I think that there is a sense that schools are no longer a place to be, when in fact they're among the safest places that a child could be. So I just think that's important to note when looking at solutions to school violence in general.
After Parkland, it sounds like Betsy DeVos created a school safety commission, and they were going to look at some of these solutions to creating a better environment. As you've noted, data shows that actually schools have been more safe outside of obviously a few high-profile issues. But one of the things they weren't going to look at was the role of guns in school shootings. Did she give a reason behind that?
I'm trying to remember. I believe she said it was outside the purview of the education department to look at such an issue, but I do not remember what her exact explanation was, to be honest.
One of the other large issues dealing with on a national stage is the role of ICE, the Immigration and Criminal Enforcement, and the way schools play a role in this. And it seems like Betsy DeVos has kind of flip-flopped on this. She said that schools should be calling ICE, and then she said that she doesn't think schools are able to call ICE. What exactly happens here in these kind of situations?
When ICE gets involved in schools?
Yes.
So the types of things that we're seeing are not necessarily cases of teachers and school administrators directly calling in ICE to take a look at an undocumented student or undocumented family. What I've been seeing is instances of school police officers who work in the schools sharing information with ICE. So, for example, there was a case that I covered in Boston Public Schools where a student didn't get in a fight, but there was an incident where it looked like a fight was brewing, and that student happened to be undocumented. The school police officer who wrote up an incident report wrote at the bottom of the incident report that this incident report should be shared with a larger police information sharing body that includes ICE. And in the incident report, it made allegations about the student being gang affiliated, and it turns out there was very little evidence of this. But by virtue of being in school and behaving like a normal teenager and almost getting in trouble, although not quite, this student ended up being deported based on this school police officer's report.
Do schools help out these students that don't have documentation?
It really depends on the school. It's completely, schools are incredibly local, and school leadership it's entirely up to them to treat groups of students as they see fit.
So we were talking about school safety and disproportion on racial issues here. So it sounds like that more white people get away with disciplinary issues while people of color and get disciplined harder. They've had issues with school police officers between getting beaten and tasered. What exactly is going on there?
Yeah, so over the past few years, there's been an explosion in the numbers of police officers that work in school districts. The problem is, while these police officers spend their day-to-day working in schools, they are actually accountable to the local police department as opposed to the school district. So they follow the same rules and policies as their local police department and not specific rules of the school. And many of them, because of this, don't have specific training to work with children, so they're applying the same use of force spectrum to hard criminals on the street as they do in schools among young children. So I've been tracking the number of students who are tasered by school police officers over the years because there's no local, state, or federal agency collecting these numbers systemically. So what I've collected is the bare minimum of how often it's happening. But what this means is that students who are misbehaving, some of them misbehaving seriously, some of them might have weapons, in which case it makes sense for a school police officer to taser them. But some of them might be just engaging in normal teenage misbehavior, a little pushing and shoving, talking back to a teacher, roaming around the hallways and not listening to authority figures. That results in them potentially getting seriously injured with a school police officer wielding harsh weapons.
You mentioned just a moment ago that states and counties aren't collecting this data. So how are you getting this data?
Yeah, so I've been tracking local outlets reporting on this issue. So every time a local news source writes about a student being tasered in school, I add that to my database. So as we know, there's a dearth of local news in many places, and also many local news outlets just aren't covering this issue. So that's why my number, while probably the most comprehensive accounting of this number that we have to date, is a bare minimum.
We've talked a lot about Betsy DeVos. She comes from Michigan. From my understanding, she was a big controversial figure in Michigan. What was so controversial about her in Michigan before she became Secretary of Education?
Yeah, so Betsy DeVos comes from an extremely wealthy family, one of the wealthiest families in the country. And education reform and school choice is her passion project. It is one of the issues that she is most involved in. So in Michigan, she was extremely involved in influencing legislators to vote a certain way. She was extremely prolific donor to specific causes. So even though when charter schools or voucher programs came on any type of ballot or there was any type of public referendum on them, there didn't seem to be a tremendous level of public support. Through her money and influence, she was able to wield policies a certain way.
So were these schools that she was cheerleading for, these charter schools, were they not performing at a high level, or was this affecting Michigan's education?
Yeah, so many of the charter schools in Michigan are performing well. And the other thing is that Michigan allows for-profit charter schools. So there are people potentially making money off of students' failures. And the state has very little accountability for these types of schools, meaning that they might be allowed to operate even though they may not be serving students well.
I also hear that Betsy DeVos is a heavily religious figure, which goes into her views. So it sounds like from your reporting that LGBTQ federal employees have complained to her about policies. What exactly is the issue around there?
So this was around her decision, in part with Jeff Sessions, to rescind federal protections for transgender students. So under the Obama administration, there was guidance put forward that said that schools should allow transgender students to use the restroom or locker room that aligns with their gender identity, not necessarily their biological sex. One of the first things under the Trump administration that Betsy DeVos was involved with was a rescission of this guidance, which means that now school districts are allowed to force transgender students to use the locker rooms and restrooms that may not align with their gender identity.
Following up on this here, were there actually issues when this policy was first enacted? Not before they rescinded it, but when the Obama administration enacted it. Were schools having issues with this?
Yeah, so there's been a constant stream of lawsuits over this issue of students suing because their school is not allowing them to use the restroom that aligns with their gender identity, or other families suing because their student or child has been traumatized because the school is allowing transgender students to use the restroom that aligns with their gender identity. So this has been controversial for the past few years.
Earlier you had mentioned that there's these for-profit charter schools. How exactly does a for-profit charter school work?
Yeah, so in the most basic sense, it just means that while public schools are nonprofit and therefore their aim is not to make money, there are charter schools where their aim and their reason for existence is to make money.
So how would they go about this? Are they charging higher rates for students to come to school there, or do they make money off students not passing courses?
No, so they're not allowed to charge money for students to attend. They're still public schools. Charter schools are public schools, but all public schools get a certain amount of money from the state and federal government. Public schools are federally, locally, and state funded. So it's about making a profit on its funding sources, from what I understand. I'm not an expert in this area by any means.
Earlier this year, the Southern Poverty Law Center reported that students aren't learning the full truth about slavery in our public schools. What exactly are schools leaving out here in this issue? Because I know you've reported on this.
Yeah, so the Southern Poverty Law Center looked at how slavery and other issues are taught in public schools around the country and looked at what's required of schools to teach in this area, as well as what many textbooks say. And they found that there was a whitewashing of this issue where students weren't being taught about the full effect of this policy, the policymakers who helped perpetuate it, and a real accounting of what happened in the aftermath.
So your latest article reported that a sick group went to the Department of Education and said to treat their religion as an ethnicity, as now I believe the Department of Justice is now treating Judaism as a race. What exactly is the issue going on here? Are religions now be considered race, or is this just an exception to these rules?
Yeah, so the issue is that the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which is the body that enforces federal civil rights law in schools, is not charged with overseeing religious discrimination. It deals with racial and ethnic discrimination in schools, for example. So it is more difficult for students who might be discriminated against based on religion to get attention from civil rights enforcers at the federal government. So because there's been this change in how the department may be treating Jewish students, it looks like other religious groups, like Sikh groups, are advocating for the same so that they can get a more fair accounting of potential religious discrimination for their students.
You also had reported recently that the Department of Education has been underreporting allegations of racial discrimination. Now, this, according to your reporting, this doesn't sound like this was an issue that just recently arose in the Trump administration. This was happening in the Obama administration past. So how exactly does this work? So if they get a complaint about racial discrimination, does this go public, or do they have to investigate and then the results of their investigation go public?
Yeah, so this has been happening for years, and potentially has been happening as long as Office for Civil Rights has been releasing data about the complaints that they receive. Basically what this means is the Office for Civil Rights puts out an annual report detailing the number of racial discrimination complaints that they've received, and these reports are used to advocate for funding levels, amongst other important federal issues. But it doesn't look like it's intentional. It doesn't look like there's anything nefarious going on. It's just that they stop accounting for all the complaints at a certain point, I found, through a public information request. So the information that is being released to the public about how many racial discrimination complaints they're receiving is underreported.
Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to understand here is, what does it mean to be underreported here?
So they stop. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to explain. It's kind of a complicated system how they calculate these numbers, but they receive thousands of complaints every year, and they don't put into their system all the complaints that they've received if they haven't gotten to them yet. So after the fact, they may end up they put them into their system once they get to them, once they're able to account for them. The information that's released to the public isn't revised, so it means the public didn't have an accurate count of what was happening with the Office for Civil Rights.
So would it be fair to say that it sounds like they're understaffed, and that's why they have a large backlog?
I personally can't point to why this is happening. I think currently, if you talk to employees at the Office for Civil Rights, they would say that they're understaffed, but I don't know if the two issues are related.
I'd like to once again thank Rebecca Klein for taking time out of her busy schedule to talk about her work over at the Huffington Post. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you.